You did something, and everyone knows. The fire is still burning, but nobody is talking, and every face in the camp is turned toward you. No police officer is walking over. There is no judge, no courtroom, no cell with a locked door waiting somewhere out of sight. It is 9,000 years ago, and the closest thing to law is the silence of 40 people who have already decided that you crossed a line. What happens to you now is one of the oldest questions a human group ever had to answer, and the way they answered it still shapes the world you live in today. We tend to imagine that justice began with written law, judges in robes, courts, prisons, a whole system that arrived to tame a lawless past. The past was not lawless. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived under rules so strict and so constantly enforced that a modern courtroom would look relaxed beside them. The rules simply were not written anywhere. They lived inside every member of the group, and the pressure to follow them never let up for a moment. So, what actually happened to an ancient human who broke the rules? The answer begins with a single fact that changes everything else. There was nowhere to run, and nowhere to hide. Picture the world these people lived in. A band of 20 to 50 people who traveled together, ate together, slept within arm's reach of one another, and depended on each other for survival every single day. In a group that size, there are no strangers, and there are almost no secrets. Everyone knows who is lazy and who is generous, who lies, who takes more meat than they give back, who quietly drifts toward someone else's partner. Your reputation was no small thing. It was the most valuable possession you owned, because it decided whether the others would feed you in a hungry week, watch over you while you slept, and stand beside you when a rival band appeared on the ridge. Break the wrong rule, and that protection could thin out and fade. Without the group behind you, life on the ancient landscape became almost impossible. It helps to know which rules actually mattered, because they were not always the ones you might expect. The deepest offense in most foraging bands was rarely plain aggression. More often, it was selfishness. A hunter who hid food instead of sharing it, a person who hoarded, a man who tried to give orders and set himself above the others, these were the ones who drew the sharpest response. Sharing was survival, and anyone who broke the sharing put the whole group at risk. On top of that sat rules about partners, rules about who could marry whom, and one almost universal line, the rule against reckless behavior that could drag the band into a conflict with its neighbors. Break a small rule and you were teased. Break one of these and the group reached for heavier tools. Imagine a hard, hungry winter. A hunter comes back with a deer, and instead of laying it all down for the group, he tucks a portion away for himself and his own children. In a full modern kitchen that barely registers as wrong. In a starving band it was close to unforgivable, because the food he kept back might have meant another family would not live to see spring. The group would know within a day, because nothing stays hidden when 50 people share one fire. And the response would come quickly, because a person who breaks the sharing while everyone is hungry has shown the single most dangerous thing an ancient human could show: that he will put himself above the survival of the group. None of this had to be forced onto every adult from scratch, because the rules were poured into people from birth. Children in these bands learned the code the way they learned to walk, by watching, by copying, and by being gently corrected the first time they took too much or shoved another child. Stories told at the fire carried the lessons folded inside them, warnings about the greedy one, the liar, the person who broke a taboo and brought trouble on everyone. By the time someone was grown, the group's rules were not an outside force pressing on them from the edges. They had become part of how the person thought. Most rule-breaking was stopped before it ever happened, inside a mind that had been shaped since infancy to care what the group would say. This is why the first courtroom in human history was not a building, it was talk. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying how hunter-gatherer bands keep order, comparing dozens of societies across the world. He found the same pattern almost everywhere. These groups were fiercely equal, and they refused to tolerate anyone who tried to dominate the rest, hoard resources, or behave like a chief. The first tool they reached for was gossip. When someone stepped out of line, the group talked, at the fire, on the trail, while gathering roots while preparing a meal. That talk did something powerful. It built a shared verdict without a single official ever being appointed. By the time anyone acted, everyone already agreed. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard, argues that this ability to talk quietly and coordinate against a troublemaker was one of the most important things our species ever developed. In his 2019 book, The Goodness Paradox, he makes a startling case. Language did more than tell our ancestors where the fruit was. It let them agree with one another out of earshot. A handful of people, murmuring at night about the man who pushed everyone around, could reach a shared decision without him ever knowing. For the first time in the animal world, the quiet majority could combine their voices into something stronger than any single dominant individual. Gossip was the beginning of the group holding real power over the person. So the response usually started small, and it started with ridicule. In many foraging societies, the sharpest tool against someone who got too proud was mockery. The anthropologist Richard Lee, who lived for years among the Jew-Hawansi people of the Kalahari, described this beautifully. When a hunter brought home a large animal, he was expected to speak of his own catch as thin, bony, barely worth carrying. If he boasted, the others teased the meat and teased him until the pride drained out of him. Lee once bought a huge ox for the group as a gift, and they ribbed him for days about what a skinny, useless animal he had chosen, until he finally understood the lesson. The point was never really the meat. It was to keep any one person from rising above the rest and turning the band into a private kingdom. If ridicule was not enough, the next step was colder. The group began to withdraw. People shared a little less freely. Conversations went quiet when the offender came near. The warmth a human being needs almost as much as water started to drain out of every interaction. This is shunning, and in a small band it lands hard. You are still there, still walking with the others, and yet you have become invisible, a person the group has decided to stop seeing. For an animal wired to need belonging more than almost anything, that cold shoulder was a real penalty, and often it was enough. The offender corrected himself, made amends, shared more, boasted less, and slowly earned his way back inside. When shunning failed, a band could take the heaviest social step of all. They could ask the person to leave for good. To us, being told to go sounds survivable, even freeing. In the ancient world, it was one of the most serious outcomes a person could face. Life alone on the landscape was close to impossible. A single human could not keep a fire, gather enough food, stay safe through the night, and recover from illness or injury all at the same time. The group was the thing that made survival possible, and being sent away from it, with nothing, was something everyone quietly feared. That is why the mere threat of it could bend the proudest troublemaker back into line. There is a gentler side to ancient justice that rarely gets told, and it is the part that makes it feel strangely wise. A great deal of the effort in these groups went into settling wrongs before they could grow, more than into punishing them. Elders and respected members acted as mediators. When two people quarreled, others stepped in to calm it, to talk both sides down, to arrange a gift that would repay the wrong and close the wound. A borrowed tool returned with something extra on top. An insult answered with a public apology. The goal was almost always the same, to restore the group to peace, because a band that split into two angry camps could not survive the winter together. Justice, for most of human history, was less about making the guilty suffer and more about making the group whole again. Almost all of this was built to give people a way back. A band could not afford to lose a working pair of hands over a single mistake, so most responses were designed to end. The teasing stopped once the lesson landed. The cold shoulder thawed once the offender shared, apologized, and showed he had changed. Even someone who had been pushed to the very edge of the group could often earn a place again through time, generosity, and a little humility. Ancient justice was rarely about branding a person for the rest of their life. It was about correcting a behavior and then folding the person back into the only community that could keep them alive. Forgiveness was a survival tool in these groups, because every member who could be repaired was a member the band did not have to do without. There was also an invisible enforcer, and it may have been the most powerful of all. In many ancient societies, the rules were watched by more than the living. They were watched by the dead, by spirits, by the land itself. A person who broke a taboo risked more than the disapproval of the group. They risked drought, sickness, a failed hunt, the anger of ancestors who were always present and always looking. This mattered enormously because it kept people honest even when no one else was around. You might slip something from a neighbor in secret, and still you could not hide from the spirits your whole world believed in. Belief became a guard that never slept, and the fear of unseen consequences held people steady through the long, dark hours when no human eye was on them. But some offenses were too serious for teasing, cold shoulders, or gifts. Betrayal that put the whole band in danger, or a person who kept harming others and simply would not stop, pushed a group toward its hardest choice. In the most extreme cases, a band could decide that a dangerous individual could no longer remain among them at all. Christopher Boehm found that when it reached this point, the decision was made by the whole community together, and never left to one angry person acting alone. The group came to agreement first, so that the responsibility belonged to everyone, and the blame fell on no one in particular. This mattered a great deal, because it kept the outcome from turning into a private quarrel that could drag on between families for years. The community as a whole carried the weight of the decision, so that no single family had to. Richard Wrangham believes this deep habit shaped our species from the inside. His argument is that over thousands of generations, communities steadily kept their most aggressive and domineering members from staying in the group, and over time, that made humans calmer and more cooperative as a species. The people who could not rein in their aggression were slowly edged out of the future by their own communities, until the more even-tempered were the ones raising children. If he is right, the peaceful, cooperative nature most humans carry today was shaped long ago by ancestors who decided that certain behavior could not be allowed to continue. Now step into the messier reality, because not every wrong got resolved so cleanly. When one family felt wronged by another, the calm group verdict often gave way to something older, the urge for revenge. In a world without courts, a serious wrong created a debt, and the injured family felt owed. This is the feud, and versions of it appear across human cultures on every inhabited continent. The trouble with revenge is that it rarely stops on its own. One act of retaliation invites another in return, and a single quarrel over a partner or a stolen animal could sour relations between two families for generations. Much of the mediation, the gift-giving, the marriages carefully arranged between groups, all of it existed to hold back this exact spiral. Between raw revenge and written law sat a clever ancient compromise, the idea that a wrong could be paid for. Many societies set unofficial prices. A serious harm might be settled with a gift of animals, tools, or a marriage that tied the two families together for good, instead of a quarrel that never ended. Paying the price was a way to close the matter before it could grow. Centuries later, the first law codes would do little more than take this old habit of compensation and write the prices down where everyone could see them. The most famous ancient body in the world may be a casualty of a conflict like this. In 1991, two hikers in the Alps found a man's body preserved in the ice. He had lived around 5,300 years ago, and he is known now as Otzi the Iceman. For years, people assumed he had simply lost his way and frozen on the mountain. Then, in 2001, a radiologist named Paul Gostner noticed something on the scans that everyone before him had missed. Otzi had not died by accident. He carried an older injury on his hand from days earlier, and the scans showed he had been caught in a confrontation he did not survive. Whatever lay behind it, a feud, a punishment, or a personal grudge, Otzi is a 5,000-year-old reminder that crossing the wrong person could be dangerous long before any law was written down. There is another kind of discovery that blurs the line between punishment and ritual. Across the peat bogs of northern Europe, Farmers and archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of bodies preserved so well by the acidic, oxygen-poor water that their skin, hair, and faces survived for thousands of years. They are called the bog bodies. The most famous of them, the Tolland man, was found in Denmark in 1950 and had lived around 2,400 years ago, his face so calm and complete that he looks asleep. The Danish archaeologist Peter Glob, who studied these remains, argued that many of them were placed in the bog as offerings, given to the gods. Researchers still debate whether each person had broken a rule, been chosen for ritual, or somehow both at once. In the ancient mind, the line between a penalty and a sacrifice was often thin. To break a sacred rule and to become an offering could be the very same fate. For most of human history, all of this happened without a single written word. Then, something changed the size of the problem. People began to live in cities. When a group grows from 50 people into 50,000, the old system breaks. Gossip cannot travel that far. Shunning means nothing when the person you shun can walk to another street full of people who never heard the story. The quiet power of everyone knowing everyone dissolves the moment most faces around you belong to strangers. So the rules had to be dragged out of living memory and pinned down where anyone could point to them. They had to be written. The oldest surviving law codes come from Mesopotamia. The code of Ur-Nammu, carved around 4,000 years ago, already lists specific offenses and the specific payments that answer them: a fine of silver for one wrong, a set penalty for another. A few centuries later came the most famous of all, the Code of Hammurabi, cut into a tall black stone around 1,750 years before the Common Era. It is the source of the phrase, an eye for an eye. The idea sounds harsh to modern ears, and yet it was doing something almost merciful. It set a limit. It said the penalty could match the wrong and go no further. The answer to a crime was fixed at a known price, so it could not keep climbing. Written law took the endless, escalating cycle of the feud and tried to cap it, to freeze the debt at a set amount so that conflict would stop multiplying with every generation. The first written laws were an attempt to make revenge smaller. Something else was lost and gained in that same shift. When the rules lived in everyone's memory, everyone was a judge, and the verdict belonged to the whole group. Once the rules were carved into stone, they belonged to whoever controlled the stone. Kings, priests, and scribes now decided what the words meant and who they fell upon. Justice gained reach and consistency, and in the same moment it slipped out of the hands of the ordinary person and into the hands of authority. The fire circle, where a wrong was judged by the same people who had to live with the outcome, gave way to a throne. We are still living inside that trade, wherever a distant court decides the fate of a person none of its judges have ever met. The next part should feel uncomfortably familiar. The system that came before the courts, the one built on reputation, gossip, shame, and the threat of being cast out, never actually went away. It is still the first system you live under every single day. Long before any police officer would ever get involved, your behavior is guided by something far older: the fear of what people will say. The dread of a room going quiet when you walk into it, the sick drop in your stomach at the thought of being talked about, judged, and pushed toward the edge of your own group. You carry a courtroom inside you that was built tens of thousands of years ago, and it runs without pause, checking every choice against the one question that kept your ancestors alive. What will the others think of me? This is more than a feeling. It is wired into the body. The neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger ran experiments in which people were quietly left out of a simple ball-tossing game while their brains were scanned. When they were excluded, the same regions that light up during physical pain switched on. Being rejected by a group registers in the brain much like a wound. That overlap is not an accident. For an ancient human, being pushed out of the group was a genuine threat to survival, so evolution made it hurt like one. The ache you feel when a group turns cold is the old alarm your ancestors could not afford to ignore. You can watch that ancient machinery running at full speed online. When a crowd decides that a stranger has broken a rule, the response is not a trial. It is almost exactly what a hunter-gatherer band would have done. The group talks. The talk spreads and hardens into a shared verdict. Ridicule comes first, then shame, then the effort to cut the person off, to make them invisible, to push them out of the group entirely. We built courts and laws and institutions on top of the old system, and the moment those formal walls stop watching, people slide straight back into gossip, shame, and exclusion. The same three tools our ancestors used around the fire. The urge to answer a rule breaker by turning the whole group against them is nothing new. It is one of the oldest pieces of social machinery we own. So think again about that silent camp. The fire still burning, 40 faces turned toward you, and no judge anywhere in sight. Your ancestors stood exactly where you are standing, in front of the only court that existed, waiting to learn whether the group would tease them, forgive them, or send them away. The verdict was never written down. It was carried in the memory of everyone who watched and passed to their children and their children's children until it reached you, still flinching at the thought of a whole room turning against